In 1919, three brothers founded a toy company in South London. By 1950, their factory at Merton covered 750,000 square feet, employed more than 4,000 workers, and ran 500 power presses, turning sheet steel into the toys that furnished British childhood. Pedal cars, prams, dolls' houses, train sets, scale extric, and more. By 1966, they had agents in 63 countries. They owned Hornby. They owned Meccano. They called themselves the world's greatest toy factory, and nobody seriously argued. By 1970, the company posted a loss worth roughly £90 million in today's money. By August 1971, the receivers were in. The brands were sold. The factories were broken up. The workers walked out of the gates for the last time. What happened to Triang is a story about scale, plastics, imports, and the moment a British industrial giant discovered that the world had moved on without it. Start at the gates, Morden Road, Merton, southwest London. A site so large it had its own railway sidings, half a mile of them, its own sawmill, its own paint laboratory, and enough floor space to cover 15 football pitches. By 1950, the Merton Works stretched across roughly 750,000 square feet, and more than 4,000 people walked through those gates every working day. This wasn't a toy workshop. It wasn't some cheerful little outfit where craftsmen sat at benches carving rocking horses. It was a heavy industrial operation, hot, loud, relentless, that happened to make things children played with. And if you didn't know what was being manufactured, if you just listened and smelled and felt the vibration underfoot, you could have mistaken it for a car plant or an armaments factory, which, as it happens, it had been. If you'd stood inside the main building on a busy morning in the early 1950s, you'd have felt it before you understood it. The noise first, the steady rhythmic crash of power presses stamping sheet steel into shapes. More than 500 of them running in banks across the press shop floor, each one punching out panels for pedal cars, pram bodies, toy trucks, pressed steel chassis. Behind that, the clatter of 1,000 hand presses doing finer work. Smaller parts, brackets, fittings, the pieces that held the bigger pieces together. And beneath everything, a low vibration that came up through the concrete and into the soles of your shoes. A factory running at full tilt has a hum to it. You don't so much hear it as feel it in your chest. The process started in the tool room, and the tool room is where you'd start if you wanted to understand what made the whole operation possible. More than 200 skilled tool makers worked here, and their job was to make and maintain the dies. A die is the shaped metal form that turns flat steel into a three-dimensional part. You clamp the die into a press, feed in a sheet of steel, and the press forces the sheet into the shape of the die. A pedal car bonnet, a pram side panel, a toy wheelbarrow body. The accuracy had to be exact. A fraction of a millimeter out and the stamped part wouldn't fit its neighbor on the assembly line. Get the die wrong and you'd scrap a whole production run. Thousands of parts, wasted steel, lost time. Get it right and the press would stamp out identical pieces all day, all week, for as long as the die held its edge. The tool makers were the aristocrats of the factory floor. They'd served proper apprenticeships. They worked to fine tolerances, and they understood metalwork at a level that the press operators and assemblers didn't need to. Quieter work than the press shop. Files, lathes, measuring instruments, concentration. But every toy that came off the end of the line started here, in the hands of a man who knew how to shape hardened steel. From the tool room, you'd follow the work into the press shop. Sheet metal went in flat. It came out shaped, bent, curved, punched, formed into the panels and bodies that would become the finished toy. The noise in here was something else entirely. 500 power presses running at once, each stroke a sharp percussive bang, metal on metal, repeated thousands of times a shift. The operators stood at their machines, feeding in blanks, pulling out pressed parts, stacking them on pallets. They needed to know their presses intimately. The tolerances, the feed rates, the way the sound changed when a die was starting to wear, or a sheet wasn't sitting square. It was repetitive work, no question. But it wasn't mindless. A good press operator could hear trouble before it became scrap. Nobody wore ear protection. That was normal for the era, not a complaint that needs making, just a fact about what the working day sounded like. You got used to it, or you said you did. The pressed parts moved on to trimming, where the rough edges left by the stamping process were cleaned off. Every pressed part comes out of the die with burrs, little flanges and ridges of excess metal where the steel has been forced into shape. The trimmers cleaned those off, filed them smooth, made the parts safe to handle and ready for the next stage. Then painting. Triang's paint laboratory mixed roughly 2,000 gallons a week. Reds, blues, greens, creams, yellows, the whole bright palette of a British toy catalog, each color matched and mixed on site. The parts were dipped or sprayed, hung on racks or laid on conveyors, and passed through drying ovens that baked the finish hard and glossy. The paint shop air was thick with fumes and warmth. That particular mix of solvent, pigment, and baking heat had a smell you'd know if you'd ever worked near it. Sharp, chemical, clinging. It followed the painters home on their clothes and in their hair, and their families knew what they did for a living without being told. After painting came assembly. This was where the thing became a toy, where all the separate pressed, trimmed, painted parts came together into something a child would recognize. Wheels fitted to axles, axles pinned to chassis, handlebars bolted on, pedal mechanisms attached and tested, seats screwed down, steering columns aligned, then the finishing touches. Decals applied, the Triang name transferred on, the model designation, the little stripes and flourishes of color that made each toy look complete. A pedal car that had started the morning as a flat sheet of steel and a tin of red paint rolled off the end of the line looking like something you'd see in a shop window. Gleaming, solid, ready to be sat in by a child who had no idea and no reason to care how many hands and how many processes had brought it into being. The whole journey, raw steel to boxed toy, happened under one roof, on one site, controlled from start to finish by one company. And that control extended further than most people would guess. Walk through a different part of the works and you'd find the sawmill, a full quarter of an acre of it, turning out timber for crates, packing cases, and wooden toy components. Triang packed its own products in its own wood, built its own crates and loaded them onto the railway sidings that ran alongside the factory. The smell in that part of the works was different again. Fresh cut timber and sawdust instead of paint and hot metal. But the principle was the same. Control the process. Control the material. Control the cost. Don't depend on anyone you don't have to. We tell the stories of what Britain built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. That was the genius of the place, if genius is the right word for something so relentlessly practical. Triang didn't just design toys. It owned the presses, mixed the paint, cut the timber, built the crates, and ran the dispatch. Vertical integration, the textbooks call it. On the factory floor, it simply meant that very little left Merton that hadn't been made, finished, and packed by Merton workers. And that gave the company something competitors found hard to match: speed, consistency, and margins tight enough to undercut the opposition. The people across all these departments were not interchangeable. Each part of the factory had its own culture, its own pace, its own hierarchy. The tool room was quiet and exacting. The press shop was loud and physical. The paint shop was hot and chemical. The sawmill smelled of timber and ran to the whine of circular saws. The assembly lines had their own rhythm, steady, methodical, hands moving in patterns worn smooth by repetition. The pram department and the doll department had different skills again. Upholstery, fabric work, finer materials, a different kind of hand entirely. And then there were the workers you'd never see from outside, the maintenance teams who kept 500 power presses running, the electricians, the transport workers loading the sidings, the canteen staff feeding thousands. A factory this size was a small town, with all the variety that implies. All of that was the peacetime operation. During the war, the same industrial discipline was turned to a purpose no one at Merton had imagined when they were stamping out pedal cars. By the early 1940s, the workforce had swelled to around 7,000, more than half of them women, and the production lines that had made toys were now producing munitions, shell cases, aircraft magazine components. But the most remarkable thing to come out of Merton during the war was the Sten gun. Lines Bros adapted the Sten Mark III for sheet steel manufacture, essentially applying the same pressed metal techniques they'd perfected on toys to a 9mm submachine gun. The skills transferred more naturally than you might expect. If you could stamp a pedal car bonnet from flat steel, you could stamp a gun receiver. The tool makers cut new dies. The press operators fed different blanks into the same machines. The assembly workers learned a new sequence. The principle was identical. The stakes were not. By autumn 1943, the Merton works had produced 876,886 Sten Mark III guns. That number matters not as a piece of trivia, but because it tells you what kind of factory this really was. Not a quaint plaything maker. A serious production operation capable of retooling for war in a matter of months and delivering at a rate that made a measurable contribution to the national effort. The women who did much of that work, welding, assembling, inspecting, packing, brought the same discipline and dexterity to munitions that their peacetime colleagues brought to prams and pressed steel toys. Many of them had never worked in a factory before the war. By 1943, they were turning out submachine guns at a rate of thousands per week. When peace came, the presses went back to making the things children wanted. The women, for the most part, went home, or were sent home. The factory shrank back from 7,000 to its peacetime establishment, and the country tried to return to something like normal, with the help of a great many toys. From the other side of the factory gates, from the shops, the catalogs, the department store displays, what you saw was something entirely different from the noise and heat inside. You saw a red pedal car with chrome trim sitting on a showroom floor, a doll's pram with a folding hood and sprung wheels, lined in fabric, sturdy enough for a real infant to ride in, a scale extric set in its colored box, promising speed and competition on the living room carpet, a Triang Railways locomotive neatly molded in plastic, running on 00 gauge track around a figure of 8 while the family watched. The child saw wonder. The worker had handled steel, dyes, paint, timber, shift patterns, and a factory hooter that told the whole neighborhood when the day began and when it ended. The company behind all this was Lines Brothers Limited, and it began as a family enterprise that grew into something considerably larger than any family could comfortably steer. Walter, William, and Arthur Lines founded it in 1919. The three brothers came from a toy-making background. Their father, George Lines, had been in the trade before them, and they wasted no time. Within 4 years, they'd acquired a 27-acre site on Morden Road, Merton, and by 1932, the workforce there had reached roughly 2,000 people. That pace of growth tells you a good deal about the interwar market. Britain had a large and growing population of children. It had a spreading network of shops, department stores, and mail-order catalogs hungry for affordable goods. And it had a manufacturing sector that rewarded firms with the discipline to mechanize, standardize, and produce at scale. Lines Bros had that discipline in abundance. Where some toy makers still relied on craft skills in small batches, Lines Bros built a system, and the system could outproduce almost anyone. The company's great strength was breadth. It didn't depend on one toy, one material, or one seasonal fashion. Through the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, the range sprawled across pressed steel ride-on toys, prams, dolls houses, wooden toys, tricycles, and eventually model railways, die-cast model cars, and slot car racing. If a child played with it in Britain, the chances were good that Triang made a version of it. And if they didn't make it yet, they had a habit of buying the company that did. The acquisitions came in waves, and each one added a new layer to the empire. In 1951, Lines Brothers bought Rovex, a small plastics firm that had produced a model train set for Marks and Spencer. That little train set deserves a moment, because it complicates the story in a way that matters later. The original Rovex set, all launched in 1950, used molded plastic bodies instead of heavier, more expensive die-cast metal. It sold for £2, 17 shillings and sixpence, roughly half the price of comparable rivals. That wasn't an accident, it was a strategy. Triang looked at plastics and saw what they could do. Lighter products, lower tooling costs, faster production, cheaper retail prices. The company didn't stumble into the new material reluctantly. It grabbed it. And for a time, Lines Bros was one of the British firms most adept at using cheaper materials and modern methods to undercut older, slower competitors. That's important to remember when the story turns, because the same logic would eventually be used against Triang itself. In 1958 came Scale Extric. Lines Brothers acquired Mini Models, the small firm behind the slot car racing system, and set about turning it from a niche hobbyist product into a household name. The timing was right. Television was spreading, consumer spending was rising. Families were looking for home entertainment that could involve everyone. And a toy that let two children, or two adults if we're honest, race miniature cars around an electrified track with speed controllers and lap counters and the particular thrill of a car flying off the bend if you push the throttle too hard, landed perfectly in that market. Then, in 1964, came the biggest acquisition of all, Meccano Limited, which brought with it the Hornby Railway brand, the Dinky Toys range, and the Meccano construction sets, three names that carried decades of British childhood associations. By 1965, the merged Triang Hornby line combined two of the most recognized names in British model railways under one roof. For anyone who'd grown up with either brand, that merger was a statement of extraordinary confidence. Lines Bros wasn't content to be the biggest. It wanted to own the landscape. By the mid-1960s, the empire was genuinely global. One account based on company records reports that by 1966, Lines Brothers had agents in 63 countries, with showrooms and subsidiaries spread across Britain, Europe, North America, Africa, and Australasia. This was no longer a South London toy factory with big ideas. It was an international industrial network. Factories, agents, brands, warehouses, distribution channels, all ultimately controlled from Merton. The enabling technologies behind all this were pressed steel and molded plastic, used in combination with a level of vertical integration that few toy companies anywhere could match. Pressed steel gave Triang its industrial backbone. Plastics gave it a route to lower unit costs and faster product development. And controlling everything, from raw materials to packing crates, kept the whole system tight and responsive. For 2 decades, it worked beautifully, perhaps too beautifully, because a system built on scale needs volume to survive. And volume needs markets that keep growing. And markets, as Lines Bros would discover, don't stay still just because you need them to. The peak is hard to pin to a single year because the high water mark stretched across nearly 2 decades from the late 1940s into the mid-1960s. During that time, Lines Brothers was consistently described in superlative terms. The company itself used the phrase, the world's greatest toy factory. Local history accounts repeated it. The borough of Merton acknowledged the works as the largest toy factory in the world. Whether or not the claim could be verified against every competitor on the planet, the scale was not in dispute. More than 4,000 workers, 750,000 square feet of factory, production running across dozens of product lines simultaneously, exports reaching 5 continents. Culturally, this was the era when Triang products became part of the texture of British childhood. Not a luxury, not a treat, a given. The brand portfolio covered what children rode, pushed, raced, built, and collected. Pedal cars on the pavement, dolls' prams on the front path, Scale Extric tracks winding between the legs of the dining room table on a wet Sunday afternoon. Triang Railways sets running their ovals on Christmas morning while the turkey cooked and the Queen's speech played on the wireless. Spot-on die-cast cars lined up on a bedroom shelf in order of size. If you grew up in Britain between the late 1940s and the mid-1960s, you almost certainly owned, wanted, or played with something that had come out of that Merton factory. You might not have known where it was made. You probably never thought about the presses, or the paint, or the timber, or the people. But the thing itself, the pedal car, the train set, the Scale Extric circuit, was as much a part of your childhood as school milk or Saturday morning pictures. Triang wasn't a specialist maker catering to enthusiasts. It was one of those firms that seemed to be everywhere at once, in the toy shop on the high street, in the department store in town, in the catalog that came through the letterbox, under the tree on the 25th of December. And those products had a quality that collectors still talk about now: solidity. A Triang pedal car felt substantial. A Triang train ran smoothly. The pressed steel had weight and durability. You could hand these things down, and people did. The older child's pedal car becoming the younger one's, the train set growing year by year, A new coach for a birthday, a signal box for Christmas, until it took up half the spare room and nobody could quite bring themselves to part with it. That ubiquity meant the company didn't just sell toys. It furnished a particular version of British childhood, shared across classes and regions and generations. And for a time, it all seemed permanent. That's the thing about being inside an era like this. It doesn't feel like a peak. It just feels like how things are. And then the ground started to shift. The forces that would undo Triang were not sudden. They built through the 1960s, gathering pace quietly, arriving from two directions at once. From outside, the economics of toy making were migrating toward countries with lower labor costs and rapidly expanding plastics capacity. From inside, the company's own structure, vast sites, multiple divisions, a spreading international network, an ever longer list of brands requiring management and investment, was becoming harder and more expensive to hold together. The import figures tell the external story with uncomfortable clarity. In 1969, Britain imported 13.549 million pounds worth of toys. Of that total, 8.032 million pounds came from Hong Kong and 1.353 million pounds from Japan. Together, roughly 69% of all toy imports into the country. Hong Kong's post-war industrialization had been rapid, and access to cheap plastics feedstock was a central part of it. Factories there could produce lightweight plastic toys at prices that British manufacturers, carrying the overhead of large unionized workforces, sprawling domestic sites, and the accumulated costs of decades of expansion, found increasingly difficult to match. The gap wasn't marginal, it was structural, and it was widening. The irony is sharp, and the story shouldn't avoid it. Triang had once used plastics and lower-cost production methods to disrupt older, more expensive rivals. The Rovex plastic train set, sold at half the price of die-cast competitors, was exactly that kind of disruption. Linesbros had been, for a time, one of the great beneficiaries of cheaper materials and modern manufacturing. But by the late 1960s, the competitive center of gravity had moved again, further and faster than anyone at Merton had anticipated. The same logic that had served Triang so well, make it cheaper, make it lighter, produce more of it, was now being applied against the company from the other side of the world, by manufacturers whose cost bases Triang simply couldn't touch. The weapon the company had once wielded was being turned on it. Internally, the strain showed in repeated restructuring. In 1964, Linesbros International Limited was formed to supervise the group's overseas companies, itself a sign that the international empire had grown complex enough to need its own management layer. By 1969, the domestic business had been consolidated from 8 divisions down to 3: Triang Pedigree, Rovex Triang, and Meccano Triang. 8 divisions to 3 in 5 years. When a company reorganizes itself that aggressively, it is usually defending rather than advancing. The simplification was an admission, quiet but unmistakable, that the empire had outgrown its ability to manage itself. Too many brands, too many sites, too many product lines pulling in too many directions, not enough return coming back, and the financial picture was deteriorating fast. In 1970, Linesbros posted a loss of £4.5 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's somewhere around £90 million in today's money. For a toy manufacturer, even the largest in the world, a loss on that scale was not survivable without outside help, and help seemed to be coming. Gallagher, the tobacco and leisure group, was reportedly prepared to invest £5 million to stabilize the business. For a few months, it looked as though the empire might be saved, diminished, restructured, leaner but intact. It wasn't. In August 1971, Gallagher withdrew its offer. The reasons were not made fully public at the time, but the result was immediate and devastating. Linesbros Ltd, the parent company, went into receivership. The world's greatest toy factory had run out of road. For the timeline, it's worth being precise, because the collapse and the aftermath overlap in ways that can cause confusion. The parent company entered receivership in August 1971. The disposal of its parts, the selling off of brands, factories, stock, and subsidiary companies continued into 1972. Some sources say the firm ceased trading in 1972, which is true of the final wind down. But the decisive moment, the moment the empire stopped functioning as a coherent whole, was August 1971. What followed was a dismantling conducted by receivers, piece by piece, brand by brand. Tri-Ang Pedigree, the pram and nursery division, was sold to Barclay Securities. The adult cycle business went to Raleigh. The wooden toy operation was bought by Goodwood Playthings. Meccano's assets passed through a holding company and were eventually acquired by Airfix. The Australasian business was picked up by Tube Investments. Rovex, the model railway operation that had started the whole plastic story back in 1951, was sold separately, which is why the Tri-Ang name disappeared from the railway range and it re-emerged in January 1972, simply as Hornby Railways. Wren, the smaller model railway firm within the group, managed to buy itself free from the receiver and continue on its own. Written down like that, it sounds orderly. A list of transactions, assets transferred, names changed, business as usual, under new ownership. But behind every line on that list was a factory, and behind every factory were workers, real people with mortgages and families and skills they'd spent years acquiring, whose employer was being carved up and sold off or shut down in front of them. In Merton, the heart of the empire, thousands of jobs were at stake. The vast works that had once employed over 4,000 people in peacetime and 7,000 during the war was being dismantled. In Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales, a later account refers to a local campaign to save 400 jobs at the Tri-Ang plant there. 400. That was one site in one town, representing one slice of the breakup. In Belfast, in Margate, across the supplier network that had fed the Merton operation for decades, timber merchants, steel suppliers, paint manufacturers, transport companies, the ripples spread outward, each disposal and each closure breaking apart the web of relationships that had sustained the empire. The Merton Works itself, that vast complex with its sidings, its sawmill, its paint lab, its banks of power presses, its quarter-acre of timber yard, ceased to be a toy factory. The buildings found other uses or came down. The machines were sold or scrapped. The skills that had sustained the place for half a century, the tool makers who cut the dies, the press operators who knew their machines by sound, the paint mixers who could match a color by eye, the packers who could crate a pedal car so it arrived without a scratch, dispersed into other trades, other industries, or into retirement. Some found work easily enough, others didn't, and the knowledge itself, the accumulated expertise of how to take flat steel, timber, and paint and turn them into 1,000,000 toys a year under one roof, simply evaporated. Not because anyone chose to destroy it, but because there was no longer anywhere in Britain that needed it. What was lost at Merton was not just a brand, or a large employer, or even a particularly famous company. It was an entire way of making things. In 1950, you could walk from the tool room to the press shop, to the paint lab, to the sawmill, to the packing hall, to the railway sidings, and every stage of the journey from raw material to finished toy happened under one ownership, on one site, managed by one workforce. That kind of integrated manufacturing doesn't just provide jobs. It creates apprenticeships. A 17-year-old could enter the tool room and, over 4 or 5 years, become a precision engineer with skills that would last a lifetime. It builds local expertise, the particular knowledge that accumulates when people work alongside each other for decades, solving the same kinds of problems, refining the same processes, passing the tricks of the trade from one generation to the next. It sustains supplier networks, the firms that provided steel, timber, paint, components, transport, all depending on that one big customer at the center. And it anchors a particular kind of community, one where the factory is the economic and social center of gravity for the streets around it, where the shift whistle marks the rhythm of the neighborhood and everyone knows someone who works inside. When a site like that closes, you don't just lose the wages, you lose the knowledge. The toolmaker who understood pressed steel dies at an intuitive level, who could tell by touch whether a die was wearing. The paint mixer who knew the formulations by instinct, who could adjust a batch by color without checking the recipe. The woman on the assembly line who could spot a defective part by feel without looking, because she'd handled 10,000 good ones and her hands knew the difference. None of that gets written down in a way that survives the closure. It walks out of the gates for the last time and doesn't come back. But the story demands fairness, and fairness means acknowledging what the new order brought. Consumers gained. Cheaper imports meant more toys and more homes at lower prices. Lighter materials meant safer, more varied products. Global supply chains meant that a child in Bolton or Bridgend or Bangor had access to a range of toys that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. More choice, more color, more variety, at prices that made play accessible to families who might once have found even a modest Triang set a stretch. Even Triang's own rise had rested on exactly that logic. The Rovex plastic train set, sold at half the price of its rivals, was an early example of the same competitive force that eventually overwhelmed the company that bought it. You cannot celebrate Triang's disruption of older rivals and then mourn its disruption by newer ones without noticing the contradiction. What changed was the industrial geography of toy making, not the human appetite for play. Children didn't stop playing. Britain stopped making the things they played with. The demand was as strong as ever. The work moved, and Triang's collapse was not an isolated disaster. The historian Kenneth Brown has shown that other major British toy firms, Lesney, Airfix, Metoy, Dunby Convex Marks, all went under between 1979 and 1985, leaving the business largely in the hands of importers. In that light, Linesbros wasn't simply an unlucky company that expanded too far and too fast. It was the first and largest casualty in a wider retreat from British toy manufacturing, an early warning, visible from 1971, that the rest of the industry didn't or couldn't heed. Go back to Morden Road now. Stand where the gates used to be. The sidings are gone. The sawmill is gone. The paint lab, the press shop, the tool room where 200 men cut dies from hardened steel, all gone. What was once described as the largest toy factory in the world is memory and redevelopment. The acreage that held 4,000 workers and 500 power presses holds other things now. The shift whistle doesn't sound. The air doesn't smell of paint. But not everything has vanished. The young V&A still holds the Lines Brothers archive, company records, catalogs, production documents, correspondence, the paper trail of an empire that ran for half a century. Collector societies preserve the objects themselves. Pedal cars restored to showroom condition, spot-on die-cast models in their original boxes, Triang Railways locomotives still running on club layouts 60 years after they were molded, scale extra sets that come out at enthusiasts' meetings and perform as well as they did in 1962. Each one of those objects carries the residue of that vast manufacturing effort in its pressed steel or molded plastic, a physical reminder of what 4,000 workers at Merton could produce when the presses were running and the paint was wet and the conveyors were moving. And successor brands carry forward fragments of what Linesbros built. Hornby still makes model railways. Scale Extrix still makes slot cars. The names survived, even if the industrial world that created them did not. They are smaller now, lighter, no longer tied to a vast factory in South London. But they still trade on the inheritance of a vanished empire. It's not a funeral, it's an afterlife. Quieter, smaller, stripped of the factory floor scale that once defined it. But still there, in the archive and in the attic, and in the hands of people who remember. Children knew Triang through what it put under the Christmas tree. The red pedal car, the doll's pram, the train set on its oval of track, the Scalextric circuit with its little cars and its promise of speed. Workers knew it through steel and timber, paint fumes and press noise, shift whistles, and the long walk home from a giant South London works at the end of the day. Two completely different experiences of the same company, meeting only at the factory gate and the shop counter. By the early 1970s, that whole world was breaking apart, not because anyone stopped wanting toys, not because the workers lost their skill or the designs lost their appeal, but because Britain was changing the way it made almost everything, and Triang, vast, vertically integrated, rooted in Merton, built on pressed steel and scale, couldn't change fast enough to keep up. The question isn't whether it was inevitable. It probably was. But understanding what the factory was, what the workers did, and what was lost when the receivers came in, that's worth something. Did you have a Triang pedal car, train set, pram, or doll's house? Did anyone in your family work at Merton, Merthyr, Belfast, or Margate? What do you remember? And what did the factory mean to your street?